The stars had always called to humanity, and in 2247 they finally answered. Captain Jacob Pierce stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge, watching the blue light of faster-than-light travel fade away as they dropped into normal space. This was it. The first time humans had traveled beyond their own solar system. Amy Santos sat at the pilot controls, her hands steady despite the historic moment. Behind them, Daniel Cooper monitored the engines while Dr. Lisa Morgan checked her sensors for any signs of life. They had traveled 12 light-years from Earth, hoping to find something, anything, that proved humanity was not alone. What they found exceeded every dream and nightmare they could have imagined. The alien ships appeared without warning, surrounding the horizon's edge in a perfect formation. They were beautiful, sleek vessels that made human technology look primitive. Jacob's heart raced as he ordered Amy to hold position. There was nowhere to run, and fighting would be suicide. Then the communication came through. The aliens spoke in perfect English, their translation technology far beyond anything Earth possessed. They called themselves the Galactic Collective, a union of 17 different species that had ruled the stars for over 10,000 years. They welcomed humanity to join them. Jacob could hardly believe it. First contact, and it was peaceful. The aliens seemed genuinely happy to meet humans. They offered technology, knowledge, and friendship. It was everything humanity had hoped for when they reached for the stars. The horizon's edge returned to Earth as heroes. Ambassador Gregory Hall led the diplomatic efforts, meeting with collective representatives who came to Earth itself. The aliens walked through human cities, shared meals with human families, and spoke of a bright future together. Trade agreements were signed. Cultural exchanges began. Humanity celebrated its entry into the galactic community. Dr. Lisa Morgan threw herself into the scientific collaboration. The collective shared genetic samples from their member species, allowing human scientists to study alien biology. Lisa spent months analyzing the data, fascinated by how life had evolved so differently across the galaxy. But then she noticed something strange. As she dug deeper into the genetic records, she found gaps. The collective claimed to be 10,000 years old, but the genetic diversity of their species suggested they should be much older. More disturbing were the markers she found, signs of genetic bottlenecks where populations had crashed dramatically. Lisa cross-referenced her findings with archaeological data the collective had shared. The numbers did not match. There were ruins of civilizations that should exist but did not. Entire species that historical records mentioned, but had somehow vanished without explanation. She brought her concerns to Jacob, who had been promoted to advisory positions in Earth's Defense Force. He listened carefully as she laid out the evidence. At first, it seemed like innocent discrepancies, perhaps errors in translation or dating methods. But Lisa had found a pattern. Every few centuries, a promising young species would emerge. They would be contacted by the collective, welcomed, and integrated. Then within a generation or two, they would disappear. The official records claimed natural disasters, plagues, or civil wars. But it happened too consistently to be coincidence. Jacob used his military clearance to access intercepted collective communications. What he found made his blood run cold. The messages were encrypted, but human codebreakers had managed to crack some of them. The content was damning. Earth had been classified as a Category 5 threat. The collective leadership discussed humanity's rapid technological advancement, aggressive territorial expansion, and violent history. They had studied human wars, human weapons, and human psychology. Their conclusion was unanimous. Humanity could not be allowed to reach its full potential. The collective had already positioned 3 extinction fleets near human space. They were simply waiting for the optimal moment to strike, when humanity was most vulnerable and least expecting attack. The plan was simple and brutal: complete extermination of the human species. Jacob immediately contacted Admiral Claire Johnson, commander of Earth's defensive fleet. She convened an emergency meeting of the Planetary Defense Council. The evidence was presented, analyzed, and verified. The conclusion was unavoidable. Humanity had walked into a trap, but it was already too late. Even as the council met, the first attack began. The mining colony on Europa, home to 15,000 people, sent out a distress signal. Then the signal stopped. By the time Earth's ships arrived, there was nothing left but debris and bodies floating in the frozen void. The collective had made their move. They broadcast a simple message to Earth. Humanity had been judged incompatible with galactic civilization. Resistance would only prolong suffering. Surrender would be met with quick, painless extinction. It was mercy, they claimed, more than other species had received. Jacob stood in the command center watching the images from Europa. Men, women, and children he had never met, murdered simply for being human. The collective called it justice, called it necessary for galactic peace. They spoke of humanity's violent nature, their wars, their capacity for destruction. Amy Santos, standing beside him, spoke what they were all thinking. The collective had created this situation. They had exterminated dozens, maybe hundreds of species over thousands of years. They had appointed themselves judges and executioners of entire civilizations. They spoke of human violence while planning genocide. Dr. Morgan pulled up her research, showing the council the evidence of past extinctions. The collective was not maintaining peace. They were preventing competition. Any species that showed potential, that could one day challenge their dominance, was eliminated. It was not justice. It was murder on a cosmic scale. Ambassador Hall attempted to negotiate, to reason with the collective. He argued that humanity could be peaceful, could follow their rules, could integrate without threat. The collective response was cold and final. The decision had been made long ago. Humanity's fate was sealed from the moment they invented faster-than-light travel. Admiral Johnson began emergency mobilization of every military asset Earth possessed. Ships that were meant for exploration were retrofitted with weapons. Orbital defense platforms came online. Every nation on Earth put aside their differences, united by the simple fact of survival. If they did not stand together, they would die together. Jacob returned to space, taking command of a battle group assigned to protect the outer colonies. The Horizon's Edge, the ship that had made first contact, was now armed and ready for war. Amy flew with him, her skills as a pilot suddenly more valuable than ever. Daniel kept their weapons and engines running at peak efficiency. Lisa worked on understanding alien technology, looking for weaknesses they could exploit. They all knew the truth that Earth's leaders were only beginning to grasp. Humanity was outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy with thousands of years of experience in warfare. The collective had perfected the art of extinction. They had done this before, and they had never failed. But they had never fought humanity before. They had studied human history and seen only violence and war. What they failed to understand was that humanity had spent thousands of years learning how to kill each other efficiently. Now they would teach the galaxy what happens when you threaten human survival. The message went out from Earth to every human colony, every ship, every outpost scattered across the solar system. The collective wanted to exterminate humanity because they feared what humans might become. Humanity would prove them right to be afraid. New Haven was supposed to be humanity's crown jewel among the colonies. 3 million people called it home, living in cities that rivaled anything on Earth. It had farms, factories, universities, and a thriving culture. Families had lived there for 3 generations, and many considered it more home than Earth itself. Admiral Claire Johnson knew the collective would target it next. The colony was too valuable, too symbolic. Its destruction would break human morale and prove that nowhere was safe. She moved every available ship to defend it, knowing it would not be enough. Lieutenant Commander Kyle Bennett led the fighter squadrons, young pilots barely out of training. He looked at their faces during the briefing and saw the same fear he felt. The simulation battles against collective tactics showed human forces losing 90% of engagements. But simulations did not account for desperation or the will to protect home. The collective fleet arrived exactly when intelligence predicted. 200 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. They were massive, each one larger than anything humanity had built. Their weapons had ranges that exceeded human sensors. Their shields could absorb nuclear strikes without damage. Admiral Johnson ordered the fleet to engage, knowing she was sending people to their deaths. Human ships accelerated toward the enemy, firing missiles and railgun rounds that seemed insignificant against the alien vessels. The collective returned fire with weapons that tore through human armor like paper. Kyle watched 3 ships die in the first minute. The collective targeting systems were perfect, hitting critical systems with every shot. Human point defense could not track the incoming fire. It was not a battle. It was an execution. But Kyle had studied human history. particularly the old wars when outmatched forces found ways to win. He remembered reading about pilots who crashed their planes into enemy ships when they ran out of ammunition. It seemed insane, but these were insane times. He opened a channel to his squadron. His orders were simple. If your ship is dying, take an enemy with you. Do not let them kill you for nothing. Make every death count. The first pilot to follow his lead was a young woman named Sarah who had grown up on New Haven. Her fighter took a hit that destroyed her engines. Instead of ejecting, she aimed at the nearest collective ship and pushed her remaining thrusters to maximum. Her fighter, loaded with missiles and traveling at combat speed, struck the alien vessel's command section. The explosion was massive, and when it cleared, the collective ship was dead in space. Other pilots saw what happened. One by one, they made the same choice. Damaged fighters became missiles, their pilots buying time with their lives. The collective fleet began to adjust their tactics, focusing on complete destruction of human ships to prevent kamikaze attacks. It slowed their advance. On the ground, Colonel Marcus Webb organized the defense of New Haven's capital city. He had 20,000 soldiers against an invasion force 10 times that size. The collective landing craft came down like rain, disgorging alien warriors equipped with advanced weapons and armor. Marcus knew they could not win. His job was not to win. His job was to buy time for the evacuation ships to load civilians and escape. Every minute his people held was another 1,000 lives saved. The battle for the city streets was brutal. Human soldiers used every trick they knew, turning the urban environment into a death trap. Buildings became bunkers. Sewers became attack routes. Every block was contested with blood and fire. Engineer Hannah Price worked frantically at the spaceport, overloading transport ship reactors to increase their capacity. She squeezed extra people into every vessel, ignoring safety regulations that no longer mattered. The ships were dangerously overloaded, but it was better than leaving people behind. In orbit, Admiral Johnson watched her fleet die. Ship after ship winked out on the tactical display, each one representing hundreds of lives lost, but the collective advance had slowed. Human resistance, though futile in military terms, was buying precious time. Kyle's fighter took a hit that destroyed his cockpit controls. He could still steer, but his weapons were offline and life support was failing. He had maybe 10 minutes of air left. Below him, one of the collective command ships was directing the orbital bombardment of New Haven. He did not hesitate. Kyle aimed his dying fighter at the command ship and activated the emergency reactor overload that Hannah had developed. The procedure was supposed to be used for power emergencies, but Hannah had discovered it could turn a reactor into a bomb. Kyle's fighter struck the collective ship at 17,000 kilometers per hour. The reactor detonation tore through the alien vessel's shields and ripped it apart from the inside. 3 other collective ships nearby took critical damage from the debris. On the ground, Marcus saw the evacuation ships lifting off. The spaceport was nearly empty. He had held long enough. He gathered his remaining soldiers and told them the truth. They were not getting off this planet. Their job now was to make the collective pay for every meter of ground. Hannah made it onto the last transport ship. She watched through the viewport as New Haven's capital burned. The collective forces were destroying everything, erasing humanity's presence from the planet. The destruction was personal, meant to send a message. Marcus and his soldiers fell back to the city's fusion reactor complex. It was designed to power 3 million people, and its emergency protocols included a self-destruct system in case of catastrophic failure. Marcus overrode every safety system and set the reactor to overload. He broadcast a final message to the collective forces. You wanted to exterminate us because you feared what we might become. Now you will learn what we are when you threaten our families. We are the species that would rather burn our own worlds than let you have them. The reactor exploded with the force of a small nuclear weapon. The blast consumed the capital city and every collective soldier in it. Marcus and his defenders died instantly, but they took 50,000 enemy troops with them. Admiral Johnson ordered the retreat. Her fleet was down to 30 ships from the original 100, but the evacuation fleet had escaped with 2 million civilians. New Haven was lost, but humanity had saved most of its people. The collective expected humanity to break after losing New Haven. They expected surrender negotiations and pleas for mercy. Instead, they received a broadcast from Admiral Johnson that went out to every corner of the galaxy. She spoke simply and clearly. Humanity would not surrender. They would not beg. For every human life taken, they would make the collective pay tenfold. New Haven was not a defeat. It was proof that humanity would never stop fighting. The collective wanted war, and now they would have it. The broadcast ended with footage from the battle. Not the defeats, but the victories. Fighters crashing into warships, soldiers holding impossible positions, a city dying in nuclear fire rather than accepting occupation. The galaxy watched and understood. Humanity would not go quietly into extinction. The collective leadership met to discuss this unexpected resistance. They had exterminated 47 species over their history. None had fought like this. None had shown such disregard for their own survival in pursuit of taking the enemy with them. It was supposed to be a quick, clean extinction. Instead, it was becoming messy and costly, but the collective had committed to this course. They could not back down now without appearing weak. If humanity survived, other species might rebel. The extinction had to continue no matter the cost. They ordered more fleets to human space, determined to overwhelm the resistance through sheer numbers. On Earth, the Planetary Defense Council watched the casualty reports come in. 20,000 dead at New Haven, another 5,000 lost in the space battle. The numbers were catastrophic, but they had proven something important. Humanity could hurt the collective. They could make the enemy pay for their aggression. Jacob Pierce sat in the briefing room studying the battle recordings. The collective had superior technology and numbers, but they fought like they expected to win easily. They were not prepared for an enemy willing to die to kill them. That was humanity's advantage, and they had to exploit it before the collective adapted. Amy Santos joined him, exhausted from flying combat missions for 2 days straight. She told him what every pilot was thinking. They needed better weapons, better ships, and better tactics. But most of all, they needed the collective to fear them. Fear would be their best weapon. Dr. Lisa Morgan was already working on that. She had studied the captured collective technology and biological samples. She knew their weaknesses now, and she was designing weapons specifically to exploit them. The weapons would be terrible, violating every human ethical standard, but ethics were a luxury humanity could no longer afford. The war had truly begun, and both sides knew it would be fought without mercy or restraint. The collective sought to exterminate humanity. Humanity would make them regret that decision, no matter what it took or what they had to become in the process. 6 months after New Haven burned, humanity had transformed itself completely. Every factory on Earth now produced weapons or ships. Every university focused on military research. Children went to school in the morning and trained for combat in the afternoon. Humanity had become what it needed to survive, a species entirely dedicated to war. President Victoria Hayes stood before the United Earth Assembly to announce the new military doctrine. Her words were broadcast across every human settlement and translated into every major Earth language. The message was simple and brutal. For every human killed, humanity would respond with overwhelming force against all collective worlds. The doctrine had a name that reflected its purpose: total response. There would be no proportional reactions, no limited engagements, no restraint. The collective wanted to exterminate humanity, so humanity would show them what extinction truly meant. If humanity died, they would take the collective with them into the darkness. Dr. Lisa Morgan now headed the Xeno Weapons Division, a department that did not officially exist. She worked in underground facilities with thousands of other scientists, all focused on one goal: creating weapons that would make the collective regret starting this war. She had abandoned every ethical consideration that once guided her research. Morality was a luxury for species that were not facing extinction. Her partner in this work was Dr. Nathan Ross, a physicist who had lost his wife and children at New Haven. Nathan brought a cold brilliance to the weapons research, unhindered by guilt or hesitation. Together, they developed the Hellfire Protocol, a weapon system that weaponized exotic matter in ways the collective had never imagined possible. The first weapon used captured collective star drive technology in reverse. Instead of propelling a ship faster than light, it created a field that destabilized the fabric of space itself. Any ship caught in the field would be torn apart at the molecular level. Nathan called it the Shredder, and it required enormous power to operate. But it worked, and that was all that mattered. Commander Amy Santos had been promoted after New Haven and given command of the 1st Retaliatory Strike Fleet. Her target was Tharxis, one of the founding worlds of the Collective. It was home to 4 billion aliens and had never known war on its own soil. Amy was about to change that. Her fleet consisted of 20 ships, all rebuilt with hybrid human and captured alien technology. They were faster than pure human designs and more maneuverable than collective vessels. More importantly, they carried weapons the enemy would not expect. The attack plan was simple but devastating. Amy would not target military installations or even government centers. She would hit the infrastructure that kept civilization running: water treatment plants, power generation facilities, food distribution networks. The goal was not immediate death but systematic collapse. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Tharxis system. Defensive platforms immediately detected them and opened fire, but Amy's ships were already moving, using tactics that confused the automated systems. Human pilots could improvise and adapt faster than any computer. The first targets were the orbital platforms that regulated climate and weather. Tharxis was a hot world that required cooling satellites to make it habitable. Amy's ships destroyed those satellites with precision strikes, knowing the planet below would begin heating within hours. Next came the water purification systems. Tharxis had limited fresh water, with most of its water supply coming from desalination plants powered by fusion reactors. Amy's ships targeted those reactors, destroying them in ways that released radioactive contamination into the water supply. The food distribution network was next. Tharxis imported most of its food from agricultural worlds. Amy destroyed the orbital docks where cargo ships unloaded their supplies. She also deployed mines throughout the system's shipping lanes, making it dangerous for any ship to approach the planet. The entire attack took less than 4 hours. Amy's fleet suffered minimal losses, and by the time collective reinforcements arrived, they were already jumping back to faster-than-light travel. Behind them, Tharxis began its descent into chaos. Amy broadcast a message to the planet and every collective world. She told them this was retaliation for New Haven. She told them it would continue until the collective surrendered or ceased to exist. She gave them a choice: withdraw from human space and live, or continue the war and watch their civilization collapse. The collective responded with outrage and promises of total destruction. They called humanity monsters, barbarians, and animals. They claimed moral superiority while planning humanity's extermination. The hypocrisy was not lost on anyone watching. On Tharxis, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Without cooling satellites, temperatures soared to lethal levels. Without clean water, disease spread. Without food imports, starvation began. 4 billion people suddenly faced an existential crisis, and their government had no way to help them all. Dr. Morgan watched the reports from Tharxis with cold satisfaction. This was working exactly as planned, but she had something worse prepared, something that would make this attack look merciful. She had developed biological weapons specifically engineered for each collective species. The weapons were viruses that targeted alien biology at the genetic level. They spread through air, water, and contact. They had long incubation periods, meaning infected individuals would spread the disease before showing symptoms. And they were lethal, with death rates above 90%. Amy received authorization to deploy the first biological weapon during her second strike against Tharxis. She hesitated for only a moment before giving the order. The virus was released into the planet's atmosphere through automated drones that would burn up after deployment. There was no way to trace it back to humanity, but everyone would know who was responsible. Meanwhile, on occupied human worlds, resistance cells formed and began their own campaigns. Sergeant Danny Ford led a group of fighters on the colony world of Kent, using guerrilla tactics against collective occupation forces. They hit supply convoys, assassinated commanders, and sabotaged equipment. Patricia Moore, a school teacher before the war, organized civilian resistance networks. She coordinated information gathering, supply smuggling, and safe houses for resistance fighters. The collective responded with brutal crackdowns, executing civilians suspected of helping the resistance. Patricia's response was to escalate attacks, proving that every act of collective violence would be answered with human vengeance. The resistance developed a reputation for ruthlessness. They showed no mercy to collective soldiers or to humans who collaborated with the occupation. Collaborators were found dead with signs around their necks identifying them as traitors. It was harsh justice, but these were harsh times. Back on Tharxis, the virus had begun its work. Hospitals filled with the sick and dying. The collective government tried to contain the outbreak, but it spread too fast. Within weeks, millions were dead. Within months, the death toll reached into the hundreds of millions. The planet that had existed for thousands of years was dying. Other collective worlds watched in horror as Tharxis collapsed. They saw their future if the war continued. Some called for negotiation with humanity. Others demanded escalation, believing only total commitment would defeat the human threat. The collective fractured, with different species arguing about the best course of action. Jacob Pierce, now a Commodore, led psychological warfare operations. His ship, the Vengeance, would appear at random collective worlds, broadcast the sounds of dying aliens from previous attacks, and then disappear before defensive forces could respond. The goal was to create terror, to make every collective citizen afraid that their world might be next. The tactic worked. Collective citizens began demanding their governments withdraw from the war. Economic activity declined as people hoarded supplies and prepared for attacks. The social fabric of the collective began to tear apart under the strain of constant fear. President Hayes addressed the United Earth Assembly again, this time to report on the success of total response. The collective had lost more ships and personnel in 6 months than in the previous century. 3 of their worlds faced complete collapse. Humanity had proven it could hurt the enemy far worse than the enemy could hurt them. But the cost to humanity was also severe. Every ship, every weapon, every soldier required resources that could have fed people or built homes. Earth's economy was entirely militarized, and there was no end in sight. People worked until they collapsed, driven by the knowledge that failure meant extinction. Dr. Morgan prepared the next phase of weapons development. She had ideas for even more terrible creations, weapons that would make the biological virus look merciful. She sometimes wondered if she had become a monster, if survival was worth what she was doing. Then she remembered Europa and New Haven, and her doubts disappeared. The galaxy watched humanity's war against the collective with growing alarm. This young species, barely capable of interstellar travel a year ago, was dismantling a civilization that had existed for millennia. They were not fighting to win territory or resources. They were fighting to prove that extinction came with a price too high for anyone to pay. The collective leadership met in emergency session to discuss options. They could not defeat humanity quickly. 3 years into the war, neither side could claim victory. The collective had lost 6 worlds to human attacks, either destroyed outright or rendered uninhabitable. Humanity had lost 8 colonies and seen Earth itself bombarded twice, though the planetary defenses had held. Billions were dead on both sides, and the killing showed no signs of stopping. General Raymond Scott commanded Earth's expeditionary forces, leading deep strikes into collective territory. He was a career military man who had studied every war in human history. He understood that wars were won not just through battles, but through breaking the enemy's will to fight. His campaigns were designed to create maximum psychological impact. The attack on Vrel 4 demonstrated his approach. Instead of destroying the planet, his forces landed and occupied it. They rounded up the alien population and forced them to watch as human engineers dismantled their civilization piece by piece. Every building, every monument, every piece of infrastructure was carefully destroyed. The message was clear. This is what happens when you try to exterminate humanity. The survivors were then transported to other collective worlds and released. They spread stories of what they had witnessed, creating terror throughout the collective. Other species began to wonder if resistance was worth the cost, if perhaps the collective leadership had made a terrible mistake in starting this war. Captain Jacob Pierce specialized in terror tactics from space. His ship, the Vengeance, had become infamous throughout the galaxy. He would arrive at a collective world, broadcast recordings of previous attacks, and give the population 12 hours to evacuate their cities. Then he would destroy those cities, whether people evacuated or not. The broadcast before each attack broke morale more effectively than any weapon. On Earth, the war effort had consumed everything. Director Angela White oversaw resource allocation, making decisions about which projects received funding and which did not. Medical research received almost nothing. Art and culture programs were eliminated entirely. Every resource went toward building ships, training soldiers and developing weapons. The population of Earth had embraced total war. People worked 16-hour days in factories and shipyards. Food was rationed strictly, with priority given to military personnel. Entertainment consisted of war news and propaganda broadcasts. Children grew up learning mathematics through calculating missile trajectories and studying biology by examining alien weaknesses. Dr. Lisa Morgan had become the most feared scientist in the galaxy. Her biological weapons had killed billions. Her latest creation was the Cascade virus, engineered to jump between different species. Unlike earlier viruses that targeted specific alien biologies, this one could spread throughout the entire collective, ensuring that every member species would suffer. Some scientists on her team protested. They argued that releasing such a weapon would be genocide, that humanity would become the very thing they were fighting against. Dr. Morgan listened to their concerns, then reminded them of Europa and New Haven. She asked them if their moral comfort was worth allowing the collective to continue existing. None of them had a good answer. The Cascade virus was deployed on the world of Krell, a major industrial center. Within weeks, it had spread to 17 other worlds through normal trade and travel. The collective attempted to quarantine infected worlds, but the virus spread faster than they could respond. Death tolls climbed into the billions across multiple species. The collective government fractured under the pressure. 5 member species opened secret negotiations with humanity, offering separate peace treaties in exchange for protection from both the virus and the remaining collective forces. Earth's government, now led by Chancellor Richard Stone, refused all offers unless they included total surrender and reparations. Stone's position was absolute. Humanity would accept nothing less than the complete dismantling of the collective and payment for every human life lost. The terms were harsh, designed to ensure the collective could never threaten humanity again. Some human leaders argued for moderation, but they were outnumbered by those who remembered New Haven and wanted revenge. Commander Amy Santos found herself in an unexpected role, training alien rebels who wanted to overthrow the collective. Several species had decided that their own governments were more dangerous than humanity, and they sought Earth's help in revolution. Amy taught them human tactics, showing them how to fight enemies with superior technology through determination and ruthlessness. The training included lessons from Earth's own history of insurgency and rebellion. The aliens learned about guerrilla warfare, improvised weapons, and psychological operations. They learned that technology could be overcome through creativity and willingness to pay any price for victory. Amy wondered sometimes if she was creating future enemies, but that was a problem for peacetime if peacetime ever came. The war had transformed human society in profound ways. Marriage rates had increased dramatically, with people desperate to create families before they died. Birth rates soared as humanity tried to replace its losses and ensure the species would continue. At the same time, divorce became almost unknown, as people clung to relationships in the face of constant death. Art and culture changed too. Music became militaristic and aggressive. Literature focused on themes of survival and revenge. Paintings depicted battles and fallen heroes. The gentle, peaceful aspects of human culture faded, replaced by harder and darker expressions. Some worried about what kind of society would emerge if humanity won the war. On the front lines, soldiers like Sergeant Danny Ford saw combat unlike anything in human history. Battles were fought with energy weapons and force fields, but the brutality was ancient. Prisoners were rare on both sides. Both humans and aliens had learned that showing mercy often meant dying, so mercy became extinct. Danny's unit had developed a reputation for taking no prisoners and showing no mercy. They were called the Dead Squad because everyone they fought died. Command tried to reassign them to less intense duties, but other units requested them specifically for the hardest missions. They were what the war had created, perfect killers who felt nothing. Patricia Moore continued organizing civilian resistance on occupied worlds. Her networks had grown sophisticated, with secure communications and supply lines that baffled collective intelligence. She had personally ordered the deaths of hundreds of collaborators and alien officers. She slept well at night, believing every death was justified. The resistance movements created chaos in collective rear areas. Occupation forces could not secure territory effectively, when civilians might be fighters and fighters might be civilians. The collective responded with mass reprisals, destroying entire towns suspected of harboring resistance members. This only created more resistance as survivors sought revenge. Back on Tharxis, the once great world was now a graveyard. The Cascade virus had killed 80% of the population. The survivors lived in primitive conditions, their civilization destroyed. Collective relief efforts had failed as other worlds needed help too, and resources were stretched impossibly thin. Tharxis stood as a monument to what happened when the collective faced an enemy that would not quit. Dr. Morgan surveyed her work and felt no satisfaction, only a grim determination to continue. She was developing new weapons constantly, each one more terrible than the last. She had designs for nanomachines that would disassemble matter at the atomic level. She had concepts for weaponized black holes that could consume entire star systems. None of it brought back the dead, but it might prevent future deaths by making victory certain. General Scott pushed deeper into collective space, conquering worlds not to hold them but to demonstrate that nowhere was safe. His forces would arrive, destroy military installations, and leave before reinforcements could arrive. The collective had no effective defense against these raids because human forces moved too fast and struck too hard. Jacob's psychological warfare had evolved into a science. He studied collective cultures, learning what they valued and feared most. His broadcasts were tailored to each species, exploiting their specific anxieties and beliefs. Some species began to view him as a demon figure, an embodiment of retribution for their leaders' sins. The younger generation on Earth had known nothing but war. 10-year-old children could field strip a rifle and calculate orbital bombardment patterns. Teenagers flew combat missions and commanded infantry squads. Education focused entirely on skills needed for the war effort. Peace was an abstract concept that older people sometimes mentioned, but that had no real meaning. Chancellor Stone gave a speech marking the 3rd anniversary of the war's beginning. He spoke of sacrifice and determination, of the price paid and the price still to pay. He promised that humanity would not stop until the collective surrendered completely. There would be no negotiated peace, no compromise, no mercy for those who had tried to exterminate the human species. The collective leadership met one final time to discuss their options. They had lost too much to continue. Their economy was in ruins. Multiple worlds faced starvation. Disease killed millions every week. Member species were rebelling or seeking separate peace. The war they had started to prevent a threat had created an actual monster, but pride and fear kept them from surrendering. 7 years after the war began, it ended not with a final battle but with exhaustion. The collective had nothing left to fight with. Their fleets were destroyed. Their worlds were dying or dead. Member species had either surrendered separately or collapsed into civil war. The great civilization that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years was finished. Admiral Claire Johnson sat aboard her flagship as collective representatives arrived to sign the surrender documents. She looked at the alien diplomats and saw defeat in every movement they made. These were beings whose ancestors had exterminated dozens of species, who had believed themselves the rightful rulers of the galaxy. Now they came begging for mercy from the species they had tried to destroy. The terms of surrender were harsh. The collective would be dissolved completely. Each member species would become subject to Earth's provisional government. War reparations would be paid in technology, resources, and labor for the next century. All military technology would be surrendered. Human occupation forces would be stationed on every former collective world. Johnson read the terms aloud, her voice flat and emotionless. The collective representatives signed without argument. They had no choice. Refusing would mean the war continued and they had nothing left to fight with. Humanity had won completely and absolutely, but the victory felt hollow. Earth's population had dropped from 12 billion to 8 billion. Entire cities were radioactive craters. The economy was a wreck, producing nothing but weapons for 7 years. Millions of children had grown up knowing only war and violence. The cost of survival had been catastrophic. President Linda Graham faced the difficult task of rebuilding both human civilization and managing the conquered alien worlds. The military wanted to maintain strict control, to ensure no former collective species could ever threaten humanity again. The civilian government argued for reconstruction and eventual independence. The debates were bitter and sometimes violent. Dr. Lisa Morgan retired immediately after the surrender was announced. She moved to a remote research station on the edge of human space, refusing to speak about her work during the war. The biological weapon she had created had killed over 17 billion aliens across multiple worlds. The number haunted her dreams, even though she believed every death had been necessary. Commander Amy Santos struggled with her own demons. She had commanded ships that destroyed worlds. She had trained aliens to fight with human ruthlessness. She had personally killed hundreds, maybe thousands of enemy soldiers. The medals and honors meant nothing to her. She could not look at herself without seeing a monster. General Raymond Scott became military governor of the occupied territories. His job was to maintain order and prevent uprisings. He did this through a combination of strategic kindness and brutal suppression. Worlds that cooperated received aid and support. Worlds that resisted faced immediate and overwhelming force. It was effective but ugly. Captain Jacob Pierce took command of the peacekeeping fleet, patrolling former collective space and responding to threats. He saw young soldiers who had never known peace, who responded to every situation with violence, because that was all they knew. He worried about what kind of military humanity had created, what kind of people filled its ranks. On occupied worlds, the situation varied wildly. Some aliens accepted Earth's rule with relief, seeing it as better than the collective's corruption. Others resisted constantly, carrying out terrorist attacks against occupation forces. Sergeant Danny Ford's unit became an occupation force, hunting down resistance fighters with the same ruthlessness they had shown during the war. Patricia Moore worked in the Provisional Government's Civilian Affairs Department, trying to rebuild societies that had been torn apart. She found it harder than fighting had been. During the war, the enemy was clear and the solution was violence. In peace, problems were complex and solutions unclear. She missed the simplicity of war sometimes, which horrified her. The younger generation posed the biggest challenge. Earth's children had been raised as soldiers. They knew how to fight and kill, but not how to live in peace. Schools had to be completely rebuilt, teaching subjects that had been abandoned during the war. Many young people struggled to adapt, finding civilian life boring and pointless after combat. President Graham met with ambassadors from former collective species to discuss the future. Some argued for immediate independence, claiming they had been forced into the war by their leaders. Graham rejected these claims, pointing out that every species had participated willingly in previous extinctions. They would remain under Earth's control until they proved they could be trusted. Other species asked why humanity was not exterminating them the way the collective had planned to exterminate humanity. It was a fair question. Graham's answer was simple: because humanity chose to be better than their enemies. Victory through genocide would make humanity no different from the collective. They would win the right way or not at all, but that answer satisfied no one. Military leaders wanted permanent occupation or worse. Civilian leaders wanted reconstruction and reconciliation. Survivors of destroyed colonies wanted revenge. Everyone had opinions, and most of those opinions involved violence. Peace was proving harder to build than war had been to fight. Dr. Morgan's weapons remained in secure storage, ready for use if needed. The technology to create them still existed, stored in databases and in the minds of those who had built them. Humanity now possessed the ability to exterminate any species in the galaxy if they chose to do so. Some argued the weapons should be destroyed. Others insisted they were necessary insurance against future threats. Chancellor Richard Stone stepped down after the war ended, unable to transition from wartime leader to peacetime administrator. His replacement, President Graham, had the unenviable task of healing a traumatized society while managing an empire humanity never wanted. She worked 20-hour days and aged visibly under the stress. On former collective worlds, reconstruction began slowly. Human engineers helped rebuild infrastructure. Human doctors treated disease and injury. Human teachers educated alien children. Some occupiers were kind, viewing their role as helping former enemies recover. Others were cruel, seeking revenge for human losses. The occupation was inconsistent and often unfair. Trials began for collective leaders who had planned and executed the attempted genocide. The proceedings were broadcast across the galaxy. Evidence was presented showing that the collective had exterminated 47 species over their history, with humanity being the 48th attempt. The judges were all human and the verdicts were predetermined. Every defendant was found guilty and executed. Some questioned whether these trials were justice or revenge. The evidence was clear that the defendants were guilty, but the proceedings lacked any pretense of neutrality. It was Victor's justice, harsh and absolute. Graham defended the trials as necessary, arguing that the galaxy needed to see consequences for attempted genocide. Ambassador Kreenoth, the last surviving member of the collective's ruling council, met privately with President Graham. The old alien asked the question that everyone wondered. Why had humanity fought so viciously when they could have fled to distant stars and hidden from the collective? Why risk extinction rather than survival through retreat? Graham's answer was simple and honest. Because running would have meant letting the collective continue their genocides against other species. Humanity chose to break the cycle of extinction, whatever the cost to themselves. They could have survived by abandoning others to their fate, but that would have meant becoming complicit in the collective's crimes. Kreenoth listened and understood. Humanity had not fought just for survival, but for principle. They had been willing to die rather than let the collective continue killing. It was noble and insane in equal measure, and it explained why humanity had won. The collective fought to maintain power. Humanity fought for something larger than themselves. 20 years after the war ended, a memorial was built on Earth honoring the fallen. 8 billion names were carved into black stone, representing every human who died during the war. The memorial covered 50 square kilometers and took a decade to complete. It stood as a reminder of what victory had cost. Commander Danny Ford, now retired and a grandfather, taught history at the military academy. His classes focused on the war, ensuring that students understood both the necessity and the horror of what humanity had done. He taught them that war should be the last resort, that peace was always preferable to violence, but that some things were worth fighting for. Dr. Lisa Morgan died alone at her research station. Her final years spent trying to find peaceful applications for the science she had weaponized during the war. Her legacy was complicated. She had saved humanity through her brilliance, but had done so by becoming humanity's greatest mass murderer. History would debate her actions for centuries. Admiral Johnson retired to a quiet life, refusing all honors and public appearances. She had sent millions to their deaths and had made the decisions that won the war. The weight of those deaths never left her. She spent her final years writing memoirs that would be published after her death, hoping future generations would learn from her experiences. The galaxy remained uneasy, watching Earth with fear and respect.